My name is Fallon Atwood, and I'm 34 years old. It was a chilly autumn evening last year. The occasion was my mother's retirement party. Around 30 guests filled the banquet hall. Everyone held a slice of cake and a fork in their hands. People were laughing, photos were being taken, and my mother was giving a speech about the achievements of her life. As always, I stood quietly in a corner of the room. I had organized almost the entire event myself. The invitations, the venue reservation, the cake, the flowers, even the guest list had been prepared by me. Yet, not a single person mentioned my name. It wasn't anything new, because, as far back as I can remember, I had always been the girl who was useful to everyone, but never truly belonged to anyone. I learned to stay quiet when I was just a child, to carry every accusation, to bury every hurt deep inside, and to smile as if nothing had happened. Maybe that's why there wasn't a trace of anger on my face that evening. Then suddenly, my mother lifted the microphone. The entire hall fell silent. She smiled and said, "Today, I want to tell everyone something that many of you don't know." Every guest turned toward her. I remained exactly where I was, without saying a word. Then she looked directly at me, smiled faintly, and said, "Fallon was never really our daughter." For one long moment, the entire room froze. Several guests exchanged awkward glances. My uncle slowly nodded.
"She's right," he said.
It's time everyone finally knew the truth. Some guests looked shocked, others looked embarrassed, and a few watched the scene as if it were nothing more than entertainment. The glass of water in my hand trembled slightly, but my expression never changed. I didn't argue.
I didn't cry.
I didn't lose my temper. Years ago, I learned that sometimes silence is the strongest answer. My mother believed she had finally broken me in front of everyone. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this very moment for months. Inside the simple shoulder bag hanging at my side was an ordinary brown manila folder. It had nothing more than a small yellow tab attached to it. From the outside, it looked like nothing special, but inside were documents powerful enough to shatter decades of carefully hidden family secrets. I took a slow, steady breath. Then I began walking toward the table. With every step, the silence inside the hall grew heavier. My mother was still smiling. She was certain the game was over, but she had no idea that the real game was only just beginning. That I slowly walked toward the table. The silence in the hall was so complete, you could almost hear people breathing. Every eye was fixed on me. Most of them were probably waiting for me to burst into tears or storm out of the room.
But
I did neither. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the brown manila folder. The small yellow tab attached to it caught the light for just a moment. Without saying a word, I placed the folder in front of my mother. She looked at it with a smirk. "What's this?" she asked sarcastically. For the first time, I looked her straight in the eyes and answered with a single word: the truth. That one word made the room even quieter. My mother reluctantly opened the folder. The first page was printed on the letterhead of a law firm. She glanced at it casually, but the moment she read the next line, the color drained from her face. My uncle rushed over. He looked at the document too, and his hands immediately began to tremble. "Where did you get this?" he asked nervously. I answered calmly, "From Grandpa's old safe deposit box." The moment those words left my mouth, my mother's breathing seemed to stop. The guests slowly gathered around us. Inside the folder, there wasn't just one document. There were old letters, bank records, legal documents, and handwritten instructions from my grandfather. I picked up one of the letters and began reading it aloud. "If this file ever reaches Fallon, then the time has finally come when the truth can no longer be hidden." The room remained completely silent. I turned to the next page. My grandfather had written, "Fallon, if you're reading this, remember one thing. You were never a burden to this family. You were always my greatest responsibility." My eyes filled with tears, but I held myself together. Then I pulled out another document. It was a receipt for a safe deposit box. Across the top, it clearly read, "Locker number 117." And beneath it was my grandfather's signature. I held the receipt up for everyone to see. Before he passed away, Grandpa transferred this locker into my name. My mother panicked. "Fallon, please stop this." For the first time in my life, I interrupted her. "Not today." For the first time, everyone is going to hear the whole truth. My uncle shouted angrily, "There's nothing inside that locker." I calmly replied, "Maybe you're right. I don't know what's inside." But Grandpa wrote that it contains every piece of evidence that would one day reveal the real truth about this family. The fear in my mother's eyes became impossible to hide. She spoke in a trembling voice. "Fallon, please let this end here." I slowly shook my head.
No.
For years, I've been the only one who stayed silent. Now, it's the truth's turn to speak. I closed the folder.
Then,
from underneath it, I pulled out a second sealed envelope. Across the front, only one sentence was written. "For Fallon Atwood's eyes only." I looked down at the envelope, then raised my eyes toward my mother. One glance at her face told me everything. She recognized it, and deep down, she already knew that whatever was inside had the power to change her life forever. The entire hall was wrapped in silence. No one dared to say a single word. My mother's eyes were locked on the second envelope in my hands. Her breathing had become uneven. In a trembling voice, she whispered, "Fallon, please don't open it." For the first time, a faint smile crossed my face. "For all these years," I said quietly, "you taught me how to stay silent. Today, it's the truth's turn to speak." My uncle immediately snapped. "This is ridiculous. She is nothing." Without replying, I calmly opened the envelope. Inside were several photographs, bank statements, and an old VHS videotape. I laid the photographs across the table. One by one, the guests leaned in to examine them. The first photograph had been taken 25 years earlier. It showed my mother inside my grandfather's study, removing a file from a locked cabinet. The second photograph was taken later that same night. It showed her handing a thick envelope of cash to another man. I spoke softly. That man was my grandfather's attorney's assistant. Whispers spread through the room. Then I placed the bank statements on the table. "This is the money that was transferred into his account that very week." My uncle grabbed the papers. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. Every document had been officially verified by the bank and matched the legal records. Then, I walked to the old VHS player in the hall. I inserted the tape. The screen flickered to life. My grandfather appeared on the television. He looked directly into the camera. Then he began speaking. "If you're watching this, it means it took me years to finally prove the truth." He pointed toward a file resting on the desk. "I suspected that Ellen would one day try to replace these documents. That's why I secretly had this recording made. But this is only one piece of the evidence. Over the years, I collected many more documents, witness statements, and records, so that one day, not even a court could deny the truth." A few moments later, the footage showed my mother removing the original will and replacing it with another file. The video ended. Silence swallowed the room. My mother slowly collapsed into her chair. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, barely above a whisper. She said, "I did it, to protect our family." I slowly shook my head. "No, you did it. For money." Then I placed one final document on the table. It was a court order. I spoke calmly. 3 months ago, I submitted every piece of evidence to the court. This morning, the judge issued an interim order. Pending the final hearing, the original will has been provisionally recognized as authentic, and every asset in the estate has been frozen. Until the case is decided, no one can sell, transfer, or use any of the property. The whispers returned. My uncle shouted, "That's impossible." I met his eyes. "If you don't believe me, be there at the next court hearing." The evidence will answer every question. Not me. Tears filled my mother's eyes. For the first time, she looked down. I closed the folder, picked up my bag, and turned toward the exit. Before walking away, I looked back and said only one sentence. Today, you stood in front of everyone and said I was never part of this family.
Now,
the court will decide who truly betrayed this family and who was betrayed. Then I turned and quietly walked out of the hall. What I didn't know was that the knock on my front door the very next morning would uncover a secret from my past that would change my life forever. The next morning, I was just about to take my first sip of coffee when the doorbell rang. I walked to the door and opened it. Standing outside was a man in his 70s. He had silver hair, a simple gray suit, and an old leather briefcase in his hand. He smiled politely. "Are you Fallon Atwood?" I nodded. He introduced himself. "My name is Harold Morgan. I was your grandfather's legal advisor and a partner at his attorney's law firm." The moment I heard his name, I froze. He immediately showed me his identification, along with his law license. "I know,"
he said gently.
"it's not easy for you to trust me. But before your grandfather passed away, he left something in my care for you." Without saying a word, I stepped aside. He walked into the house. He placed the old briefcase on my dining table and slowly opened it. Inside was a small wooden box, an old diary, and a sealed envelope. Across the front, only one sentence was written. "For Fallon Atwood's eyes only." My hands began to tremble. I carefully opened the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my grandfather's. "If you're reading this letter, it means you've taken the first step toward the truth." I continued reading in silence. "Fallon, you were always made to believe that you were a burden to this family. But the truth is exactly the opposite. You are my greatest responsibility and my final promise." My eyes filled with tears. I turned the page. Another sentence waited for me. "The safe deposit box I left in your name doesn't only contain wealth. It contains the evidence that will change everything you believe about your life." I looked up at Harold. "Do you know what's inside the locker?" He smiled softly.
"No."
"Your grandfather gave me only one instruction. No one opens that locker except Fallon Atwood." Then he slid the small wooden box across the table. I slowly lifted the lid.
Inside
Was an old brass key, a silver ring, and the original receipt for locker number 117. I picked up the key. It looked so ordinary, yet somehow, it suddenly felt more valuable than anything I had ever owned.
Harold looked at me.
"If you're ready, we can go to the bank today." I answered without hesitation. "I'm done waiting." We were just about to leave when my phone started ringing. The caller ID displayed one word.
"Mom."
It was probably the first time in years that she had called me herself. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then answered. There was complete silence on the other end. A few moments later, I heard my mother's trembling voice. "Fallon, please, don't go to the bank." My voice turned cold. "Why?" She stayed silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, "Only one sentence. If you open that locker, a truth will come out that neither you nor I will ever be able to change." The lines suddenly went dead. I stood there quietly for a moment. Then I locked my phone and wrapped my fingers tightly around the key. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had only one decision left. No matter what it took, I was going to open locker number 117. Because deep down, I already knew the real answers about my life were waiting for me inside. The next morning, Harold and I set out for the address that my grandfather had written inside the red file. The entire drive, one question kept circling through my mind. If Evelyn really was my biological mother, was she still waiting for me after all these years? About 2 hours later, we arrived in a quiet little town. The address led us to a small but beautiful white house. Colorful flowers bloomed in the front yard. A wooden porch swing rocked gently in the breeze. My feet suddenly felt too heavy to move. Harold looked at me and said softly, "If you're ready, knock on the door." I took a deep breath and knocked. A few moments later, the door slowly opened. Standing there was a woman in her early 60s. Time had left gentle lines across her face, but there was an unmistakable warmth in her eyes. She smiled politely. "Yes. Can I help you?" My voice trembled. "Are you Evelyn Harper?" The moment she heard her name, she fell completely silent. A few seconds later, she quietly replied, "Yes, I'm Evelyn." I reached into my purse, pulled out the old photograph, the same one my grandfather had shown in his video, and handed it to her. She looked at the picture, then at me, then back at the photograph. Suddenly, her hands began to shake. Where did you get this picture?" she whispered. I answered softly, "My grandfather gave it to me. He told me that one day I needed to find you." Tears instantly filled Evelyn's eyes. She looked at me carefully, then asked in a trembling voice, "What's your name?" I swallowed hard. "Fallon." The moment she heard my name, a sob escaped her lips. She gently cupped my face with both hands. "Fallon," she whispered through tears. I chose that name. My own tears finally broke free. Without thinking, I wrapped my arms around her. 34 years of separation collapsed into a single embrace. We stood there, holding each other, crying without saying another word. After a while, she invited me inside. The moment I stepped into the house, my eyes stopped on a closed door. Evelyn slowly opened it. I walked inside and froze. The entire room had been waiting for me. There was a small bed, shelves filled with toys, children's books, drawings on the walls, and a large wooden wardrobe. Evelyn opened the wardrobe doors.
Inside,
34 gift boxes were lined up in perfect order. Each one was labeled with a different birthday. Age 1, age 2, age 3, until finally, age 34. I stared at them in disbelief. Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Every year, on your birthday, I bought you another gift. Everyone told me to accept that you were gone, but a mother's heart could never believe her daughter was truly gone." I couldn't hold back my tears. For the first time in my life, I looked at her and quietly said, "Mom." The moment she heard that word, she broke down completely. Still crying, she reached into the wardrobe and took out a small diary. "I wrote this for you." I opened it carefully. On the very first page, she had written, "If my daughter ever comes home, I want her to know that I never stopped waiting for her, not even for a single day." I closed the diary and held it tightly against my chest. Just then, the sound of several vehicles pulling into the driveway echoed outside. Evelyn and I hurried to the window. Outside, 2 police cars, a black SUV, and a white sedan had stopped in front of the house. A few moments later, a police officer walked up to the front door. Behind him stood Ellen and my uncle. My heart began pounding. The officer spoke calmly. "Miss Fallon Atwood?" I nodded. He showed me his badge, then said, "We're here under a court order to speak with you immediately." I felt my stomach tighten. "What's happened?" The officer answered seriously, "We're not here to arrest you. We're here to place you under protective custody as a key witness." I stared at him in confusion. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "During the investigation, we found someone who personally witnessed the entire conspiracy 34 years ago. He's finally willing to testify in court, but he has one condition." I asked without thinking, "What condition?" The officer looked me in the eyes. "Before speaking to anyone else, he wants to meet you, alone." Only one question echoed through my mind. Who was the man who had stayed silent for 34 years? And why had he finally decided to tell the truth now? I looked at the police officer in disbelief. "Who is he?" The officer answered. "His name is Robert Hayes. 34 years ago, he was a junior records officer at the same hospital where you were born. Today, he is the last living witness to the entire conspiracy." Evelyn and I left with the police immediately. A few hours later, we arrived at a government guest house. An elderly man sat waiting for us in a wheelchair. The moment he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. In a trembling voice, he said, "Fallon, please forgive me. If I had told the truth that day, you would never have been separated from your mother." I quietly took a seat across from him. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out his old employee identification card. Then, he handed a thick file to the police officer. Inside were certified copies of the hospital's original birth records, financial payment records, and sworn affidavits from 2 former hospital employees. Robert's voice shook as he spoke. "Ellen worked with a corrupt hospital administrator to alter the records of your birth. You were illegally taken away from your biological mother, and later, forged legal documents were created to make it appear as though everything had been a lawful adoption." He lowered his head. "I tried to stop them, but they threatened to fire me and harm my family. I was afraid, and I've carried that guilt every day since." Silence filled the room. The police took custody of every document. Several weeks later, the case reached its final hearing. My grandfather's hidden evidence, the bank records, forensic reports, Robert's testimony, and every supporting document were presented before the court. After reviewing all of the evidence, the judge ruled that the conspiracy to conceal my identity, forge legal documents, and illegally separate me from my biological mother had been proven. Every forged document was declared invalid. My legal identity was officially restored. Evelyn Harper was recognized as my lawful mother, and my grandfather's original will was fully reinstated. The court also found Ellen and my uncle guilty of forgery, tampering with official records, fraud, and related criminal offenses. They were sentenced according to the law, and justice was finally served. Several months later, Evelyn and I were sitting together on the porch of the little white house. In front of me were 34 gift boxes, every birthday gift she had bought for me every single year I was gone. I opened the first box. Inside was a tiny teddy bear. The second held a children's storybook. The third contained a beautiful silver locket. Each gift came with a handwritten letter. I unfolded the first one. It contained only one sentence. "If my daughter ever reads this letter, I want her to know that I never stopped waiting for her, not even for a single day." Tears filled my eyes once again. Evelyn gently took my hand. At that moment, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my inheritance. I had found my true identity, my real mother, and the home I had lost before I was old enough to remember it. Today, whenever someone asks me, "Did you ever forgive Ellen?" I simply smile and answer, "Forgiveness is a personal choice, but justice is everyone's right." I never allowed hatred to take root in my heart, but I never allowed the truth to stay buried either. Because the truth may arrive late, but when it finally does, not even decades of silence can stop it from being heard. The end. And if you enjoyed the story, and you'd like to hear more emotional stories filled with family secrets, betrayal, justice, and revenge, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share it with your friends and family. Your subscription means the world to us and inspires us to bring you more powerful stories like this. We'll see you again in the next unforgettable story. Until then,
Take care.